So, Devry, how did you become a writer?
Well, that goes back pretty far. When I was in elementary school, I wrote an essay, and a teacher said, "What are you going to do with this talent?" And I didn't think I would do anything with it because I was interested in only in sports. I thought I would, with my talent, I would go into tennis or some other sport. From then I went naturally into writing because I had a tendency to follow everything that my brother Everett did. He was the only one I had in the world to follow, and when he started writing in high school, I did too. We both edited all the papers and magazines in our careers in school. Besides that, when I got into college, I started writing professionally for all the magazines in New York. At that time, magazines were the main form of advertising. Radio took a second place to the women's magazines, and they were a great source for publication, and I wrote for all the women's magazines and all the humor magazines. I wrote for Punch in England, and I could change my character. I could re-identify myself and invent myself for anything I had to write. For the women's magazines, I would write from a feminine point of view. For the New Yorker, I would write very sophisticated. For Punch in England, I would be very English. And if I wrote for the pulps, I would be very macho. And that continued throughout my writing career. It was just a matter of imagination and need, the need to write that way. The purpose of writing for me was earning a living. And so I wrote for the money at all times and seemed to know just what to do to reinvent myself for that purpose. Everett had been a writer for the magazines too, for the same purpose, to earn a living, and he was brought out to Hollywood by MGM, I believe it was, the same studio that brought me out off my magazine work. I got a letter, and then a phone call, and they said they wanted to hire me. It was one of those infamous 7-year contracts, a contract that they could break, but the writer couldn't. They had the same contracts for actors too, and they asked me if I wanted to come out by plane or train. I hesitated and said I'd like to come out by boat. And there was another hesitation, and they said, well, okay. So I came out by boat on the Dollar Line, went through Batista, Cuba, and had a ball. Then finally I arrived here to join my brother Everett, who was ensconced at the Garden of Allah, of all places. It was just gorgeous then, with the biggest writers and actors hanging out there. And that started the whole thing, and it was a ball. Everett and I had our own separate careers doing the same thing, but that way we seemed to make more money just by being separate. We did collaborate on many things, but not on assignments. And Everett was very skillful at telling stories. And so when we created a story, we would let him go in and tell the story. And then he would call me and say something like, "Hi, Dev, is $40,000 enough?" And I'd collapse with joy.
Because he did what, The Secret Life of Walter Mitty,
Yes.
Everett, and
Glass Bottom Boat.
Glass Bottom Boat, Marjorie Morningstar,
and
my man Godfrey, one of my
and Jim Thorpe, All American.
Right, Jim Thorpe, All American.
Yeah.
George Washington slept here?
Uh,
How do you think, since we're talking about Everett, how is it that two brothers could wind up in the industry and be so prolific and successful?
well, we were both writers and just nothing else. And we both followed the same path in college. He was writing for television, for magazines and radio, and so was I. I was writing for the Eddie Cantor and the Philip Morris Page Boy while I was still at college. And when I was at college, I was almost never off the newsstands. My English teachers didn't dare give me a bad mark.
Yeah, how do you give you a grade when you're published already? Tell me about your Armed Forces radio stint.
Well, I had been out in Dayton, Ohio, writing training films, and got a commendation for writing training films for the C-47, the plane that's credited with winning the war. So I feel that I alone won the entire war. And
Not many can say that.
yeah, but there were just loads of Hollywood people out there, including this is Dayton, Ohio, including Ronald Reagan and a million others. Names that would be familiar too. Charlie Lederer was out there. My brother Everett was out there, and off that I applied for an officership in the Navy. I liked the Navy. I liked ships, and I got a Navy commission. But and then something in my experience made them see the light on the word radio, and they say, "Oh, this guy has to become a communications officer." So they sent me to Harvard, and I learned to be a communications officer, and but I wanted a ship. And twice they sent me to get a ship after that, but then always pulled me back, and I finally wound up at Armed Forces Radio Service. And that too was because of my experience and my background. Pat Weaver was there, and I helped him open up the Navy branch of Armed Forces Radio Service. And we had G.I. Jill there, Marty Wilkerson, and a lot of other Hollywood people, and we never stopped working, both for Armed Forces Radio Service, and a few of us had Hollywood jobs on the side that we did. Nobody really liked it because they were doing the same thing they had done all their life, and they figured in a war you had to do something different, you know. So I really wanted to get a ship, but never could get one. I was sent to San Francisco twice to pick up a ship, and they pulled me back. It was a tremendous job of writing and producing. We were there for entertainment. We didn't get serious very often. It was either comedy or music or things like that. It was entertainment for the troops abroad. And that was the main content. And we all worked very hard, and it was just the same work we always did, to order. The logical segue from Armed Forces Radio Service was to commercial radio, which at that time was controlled entirely not by the networks but by advertising agencies. They did all the creativity, the hiring, and made all the decisions. And the one that I worked for at that time was Baby Snooks, Fanny Brice. And we had a lot of wonderful writers working with us. Everett, my brother, worked on it too, and Jess Oppenheimer also was on with us as a collaborator. And an interesting thing happened to us immediately after, on our first movie assignments after that, and that is we were so inured, we were so used to writing for a child woman that in our first pictures, that's the way we wrote. Before Jess ever did Lucy, who was he did as a child woman, I did a picture with Lucille Ball at Columbia and played her entirely as a child woman.
Now, it's ironic.
That was Miss Grant Takes Richmond. Jess was, I could only call him brilliant, fun and brilliant. He was just intellectually very, very intelligent and a wonderful guy. I just loved him. And working with him was always a joy. We had nothing but fun, laughed all the time, and were very considerate of each other. Hollywood at that time was not highly competitive. Everybody seemed to know each other and love each other. Sex or drinking or things like that were very, very strictly banned, and scripts would be changed by any hint of that whatsoever. Otherwise, they didn't interfere with the content too much. The natural segue was into pictures. This was before, a little before at the very beginnings of television, so we went back to pictures, and we got assignments there. They were called assignments, just that, and that's what they were. An assignment meant one job on one picture, and it was usually tailor-made to order. You did what they wanted you to do. For the most part, you try to make an assignment last as long as possible, because that was your living. But you just naturally rocketed from one assignment to another. And a successful writer never got on the set, because while his picture was shooting, he was on his next assignment, and that was important. And you just rolled from one to another, and you could have as many as 10 assignments a year. At Metro, L.B. Mayo was at that time hiring everybody in the world, and not every writer was getting an assignment. He was just hiring directors. Particularly he favored Middle Europe. As Charlie Lederer once said, an easy way to end the war would be to drop third acts on the middle of Europe. And they'd never come over here. And anyway, a writer didn't necessarily get assignment on a particular story at Metro. He may have gotten just repair jobs. I worked for years for Arthur Freed, working on all his musicals and being assigned to them. And when somebody wanted me for an assignment on a feature picture, he sent a note to Mayer, said, "No, I have plenty of work for this young man," meaning patching up his pictures, getting lead-ins for musical numbers, things like that. He had given me an office overlooking a mortuary at Metro. Writers didn't have much importance at that time in a sense of fame or respect. They really didn't. There are so many reviews of pictures of mine and other people's in which the writer's name is never mentioned at all. I have these reviews. Even if you did a solo screenplay, they mentioned everybody else but the writer and told how wonderfully the director did with the material, things like that. Life was nevertheless a total joy at that time. People don't believe you when you say how wonderful those golden years were, but it was complete fun. Writers never left the studio to go home to dinner. They met at the gate and said, "Where are we going to eat tonight?" And they were always together. It was wonderful. Everybody helped each other. I remember one time Paul Jericho was out of work, and the writers got together and got him a job at Metro. They just were very helpful to each other. We had a small office on Cherokee Street in Hollywood that at the start of the Guild Union, of the Guild, and that didn't change till much later when it became the Writers Guild of America, but it functioned very well. We had always at all studios a writer's table, which was a blast. And I think it was Winston Miller who started the writer's table at MGM. But getting together and staying at lunch as long as possible was part of the procedure. Now, a writer can only work just so long during a day unless he's on a deadline. And many of us were on deadlines and had to work all day and all night. But if you weren't on a deadline, then the chief pastime at that time was playing the word game. The word game was brought to Hollywood by Frank Cannell, a magazine writer, who brought it first to Metro, and then it spread to the other studios, and it was played constantly. It was no problem at Warner Brothers when Jack Warner decided that all writers have to come in at 9 o'clock and never leave before 6. And what we did was write for 4 hours and then play the word game the rest of the time, except for Jim Webb. Jim Webb never played. He was always busy in his office with his stocks and bonds, and he continually bought stocks. I once asked him, I said, "Jim, you do a lot of buying and selling." He says, "No, I don't. I only buy." And he got very rich that way. He was very, very, very good at it.
So,
And I admired him especially for what I thought was courage in having lunch one day with Virginia Mayo and letting her pick up her own check. That took a courage that I would never have.
As a charter member of the Writers Guild, tell me what it was like at that time when it was first starting up.
Well, it started out a long time before that. As a charter member, I think that it started in '52, the WGA. But going way back beyond that to 38, 39, these were the beginnings, as I said, on Cherokee Street in Hollywood. And it was very, very difficult for writers in the sense that credit was determined by studio whim or contract, and it was very hard to fight that. And it wasn't that writers objected to it in any way. They were mostly glad to have a job and be working. But it was, of course, unfair to many, many writers. In my own case, I wrote the original script with Freddie Finkelhoff of Anchors Aweigh and got no credit on it. It was contracted later to somebody else, I think Isabel Lenart or something like that. Now, I didn't mind. I thought that was life and the way things were. It didn't matter to me. I had a job. I was making money. That's what I thought I was supposed to do. And it apparently didn't matter to Freddie Finkelhoff. And so we let it go. Later on, when I was one of the organizers of the credit committee, but not for that reason, but just because it was the right thing to do. Later on, it became almost a tradition that the first writer on a script was to be respected, even if enormous changes were made, because that first script gave you all the points of departure. And that was a big gift to give to a writer at the time. In the beginnings of the union and the studio's attitude toward it, the studio's attitude was all defined by money and nothing else. We had no trouble with them on credits whatsoever. They didn't object to that at all. It had nothing to do with money. And they were delighted to have that burden taken off their hands. But minimums and everything else were something of concern to them, which they automatically counted. And it took our joining together finally in common cause to really accomplish something. We were, the studios encouraged the other groups to join together as separate unions, and but they didn't prevail. And finally, we did join in common cause, and I think it was 1941, the first minimum basic agreement. And then it was not till 52 and 53 that we had further benefits. But 1941 was the start. I do want to tell you about the fun we had in early Hollywood. And one thing that comes to mind is what I would call the greatest revenge anybody ever had on a fellow worker. And that was Charlie Lederer's revenge on Sam Zimbalist, the producer at Metro. He had a beef against Sam Zimbalist. They'd had a small argument, not big, but he felt resentful and he wanted to get revenge. And this was Christmas time. So what Charlie did was put an ad in the trade papers offering $5 for used Christmas trees, and he gave Sam Zimbalist's name and address. You can never imagine the havoc that resulted from that. There were like 2,000 Christmas trees on Sam's lawn, and he's outside arguing, no, not me, to people that's still coming in by the loads. It was exquisite. Things make themselves apparent. You see it in yourself and other writers, what the needs are, and then you feel remiss if you don't do something about it. Like very early, it became apparent that it was unfair that we not determine our own credits. And so you just go in and do something about it. You say something about it, and before you know it, you're involved yourself. And the same thing happened with insurance for writers. You see the pain around you and the unemployment sometimes, and you say, there's a need here. And then so you have to, like a vacuum, you have to rush in to fill it. And it happens that way continuously. And this has occurred with all the 100 committees that I've been on. You see the need, or somebody else points it out to you, and then you're remiss and sinful if you don't do something about this. And this particularly happened to me with the Motion Picture and Television Fund, which I think is the most magnificent charity that ever existed. It's where 99% of the dollar goes directly to where the pain is and the need. And, people are running it themselves, people in the industry, and not paying people to handle it all. We're doing it ourselves. And once you see the purity of this charity, then your heart goes into it entirely, and you're lost. You just know you're committed, and you are committed. And I work very hard on it, and I just love everything I do, and I'm very happy about it.
What do you think is so important about the Writers Guild?
That it fills the need of writers in all departments. It fulfills the need for minimums, employment, and everything else. Community. We never had community in the early days in a sense of being together in a joint effort to make things better. And here we are together, beautifully together, in a joint effort and making things better for all writers. The interesting point about the Guild is that so much is taken for granted. For every gain we've had in the Guild, there was an endless struggle. A lot of people, a lot of manpower, a lot of brain power went into each of the gains that we have. In my own case, I can think back to credits, when credits were solely arbitrated by the studios, and many misdeeds. Some writers who would write an entire script by themselves, a first script, would never get credit. And now, of course, we have an entire committee who has discussed this for years. We have people reading your scripts, determining credits. It's an entire process for your benefit. And the same thing applies to insurance. There were many writers unemployed and in pain, sick, no money, and something had to be done. This became a long, hard fight. And now you have in place an insurance system and a health system that is one of the best in the country. There are writers themselves who have it and have needed it are quick to praise it. There is nothing better in a country than the Writers Guild insurance program. And the same applies to all the other gains that we've had, too many to mention. The system in the old days was, of course, based on the 7-year contract. But when you didn't have an assignment, the studio would be only too glad to lend you out. And at one time, I was lent out to Columbia, I believe it was, and Red Skelton was too. And we made a picture called the Fuller Brush Man. And this somehow made MGM angry because it was very successful. So they called me back and said, "Can you do this for us?" And I said, "Sure." They said, "How do we know you can do this?" This is a lawyer speaking. And I said, "Well, I just think I can. What do you suggest?" Well, they suggested a step deal with about 10 options. First, come in with a title that's exploitable. Then write a story, an outline, then write an outline of it. Then write a treatment of it. Then write a first draft screenplay, and so forth until final draft. And what I did was pick a title called The Yellow Cab Man, which suited them. And then I did everything by steps, as I said, and they picked up all the options. And in the end, for these smart lawyers, it cost them about 5 times what they would have paid me had they just made an ordinary deal. But that's what the lawyers did. And this went on and kept on going. A successful writer was always on his next assignment. The result was that I wrote about 4 or 5 pictures for Red Skelton, most of them cult favorites, and never met him. I never met him once. Never spoke one word to him, not even on the telephone. And yet I wrote 5 pictures for him. I was always elsewhere. Same applies to most of the pictures I worked on, whether it was Eleanor Powell or Bill Holden or Rosalind Russell. I never did get to meet my stars. I was on something else. This was known as a successful writer. And a reason Winston Willer once said angrily to me in the hall, "You're always working." Fox Studios did an adaptation of my novel, Father Sky, which became the picture Taps. I feel they did an excellent picture, but it wasn't my novel. This happens to so many writers and novelists. What had happened was that I had written a novel based on my experiences when I went to a military academy in New Jersey at the age of 5. At that time, I carried a gun and everything military, and my story was about the students there when the state wanted to take their guns away, declaring war against the state of New Jersey and winning it like little gentlemen. And they were afraid to cast it with 5 or 10 years old kids, and decided to do it with 19-year-olds, which made it a different story. So they got Sean Penn, Tom Cruise, people like that. This was like their first picture, these fellows, and they did very well. And it was a nice picture, and but it wasn't my book. And I think that the book should be done. I think it would be a great Disney picture. And but anyway, we would see about that. But that happens so often to writers.
See, now that's amazing. Can you imagine 5 or 10-year-olds cast in that?
Yeah.
And
That's
incidentally, I wrote a letter not long ago to a place I thought was still there, Pennington, New Jersey. The academy in my book was called Peddington. And I said, if you still exist, I just want to say that I went there in 1918. And Pennington Military Academy. They wrote back and said, you must have the wrong school, because we're a Methodist seminary, and we're one of the largest schools in the world, and things like that. And I wrote back and said, well, you must be wrong, because there's only one Pennington, New Jersey, and there couldn't have been 2 schools. If you did, you would know about it. And I described their gymnasium, and I described their indoor pool. I said your gymnasium was 2 stories tall with a big balcony around it, and you had an indoor pool, and you were on 60 acres, and the teacher of the little children, my age, 5, was a Mrs. Butsy. I got an excited letter back, and then phone calls. They had a printed history of 1918 with children in uniform in the front row, 2 of which must have been myself and Everett, my brother, and a picture of the 2-story gymnasium, indoor and outdoor, an indoor pool, and a name on the roster of teachers, Mrs. Butsy. And they're all excited. They're going out of their minds. And on this Wednesday, 2 days from now, somebody is coming out here to interview me, and I will see them.
That's wonderful. That is terrific.
But this was an incident, you know,
I
the
mean, that's amazing.
basis of TAPS.
Now, let's backtrack. What was it like to do the last Abbott and Costello film, Dance with Me, Henry? What was that like?
Another assignment.
Well, it was their last one.
It was
together.
the last one. It was old. I did it on assignment. Everything I did in the world seems to have been on assignment, trying to do what they asked me to do, and sometimes it becomes very, very difficult. At one time, I was asked to do a sequel to Dear Wife, which they were going to call Dear Brat. And I said, fine, as I always do. And they said the only one thing, we can't get Bill Holden for it. I said, that's okay. And they said, we also can't get this female star and this and that. They couldn't get anybody in the original cast. I said, that's okay. They said, oh, another thing, we have to make it for under 300,000. I said, that's okay. And they said, this was at Paramount Studios. They said, oh, one more thing, Dev. We have to have it on the sound stages in 6 weeks. I said, that's okay. And it came out to be Dear Brat with Mona Freeman, and a very successful picture.
Tell me about your move into television. Did you, studio executives normally didn't like that, correct? Or was your contract over? How did you make your move into TV?
Just being hired for an assignment. Most of the things I seem to have gotten into initially were things that were in trouble. Like the first one, I think, was The Thin Man, and they were losing their pickup. And I had been writing for them just on assignment, and I loved the form because I was used to the short story form. And in this form, you had to write an entire story, beginning, middle, and end in 24 minutes. This was a half-hour show with commercials and introductions and main titles and everything else. And I loved the form. I actually did. And they liked what I had done for them, and they asked me if I would produce and get them a renewal. I said okay, as I always did. And incidentally, at that time, they were hiring writers as producers because they figured that writers could rewrite at night or on the stage and get it on the boards no matter what, which was more or less true. There were no such things then as story editors. So I was hired to get the renewal, and I asked them, fine. I said, fine. How many scripts are we ahead? They said, none. I said, you have no scripts? They said, none. I said, wow, you know. So, but anyway, I took the job, as I always did. And I started to work with writers and write myself. I was, for the next 13 weeks, I think I was up every day and every night, writing at night and in the office in the daytime, producing. We got the renewal, and I wound up at Cedars, and I really almost died. I was so sick. I just wanted to die. I was so tired and sick. But I got the renewal. That's what I was trained to do.
I mean, it must have been phenomenal to be there pioneering television.
It was fun. Everything I did in Hollywood seems to have been fun. I enjoyed everything. The fact that I got sick on it was pure accident on the Thin Man, but everything else. But I enjoy doing it.
You were also a TV programming executive. So
Yes.
tell me, that's
Well-
got to be one of the hardest jobs there is.
Yes, well, before that, I had gotten a reputation as being a show doctor off the Thin Man, and so I did the same thing on Ann Southern. They were losing their pickup, and Bert Granite had very nicely given me a job at Desilu, and I was assigned to Ann Southern. And they were in a tough spot because what they had was Ann going out into the lobby of a hotel saying, "Who's in trouble?" And this quite naturally made for an anthology show. And obviously wrong to me. And what I did was go to New York with several executives from Desilu and speak to the people there, which were the ad agencies, and tell them that we were going to make a change in the show, and could they give us the pickup off that. And what I said is, we're going to make a family out of it. We're going to have a daddy and a son, and we made the manager the daddy, and we made the bellboy the son, and things like that. So we had a company, and what we did turn the show around. We turned it inward on itself, and it became a hit show. It became the following year the #1 show. It beat out the Danny Thomas show the following year. I loved working on the Loretta show just as I had loved working on all the hour anthologies in the original television with Martin Manulis and John Frankenheimer. Those were the joys of my life and my entire career in Hollywood. I loved nothing better than those beginnings of television. But it was the same on the Loretta Young show. I was able to write stories that I loved, fiction, and I became a hit with her doing a particular character which was called Inga. And so she had me do Inga 1, Inga 2, Inga 3, and so forth. And I also did another show that as a pilot for them, with a little magical man that was the invention of the girl's mind, that only lived in the girl's mind, but which the audience saw. And we did try to sell it, but they said, fantasy doesn't go. Subsequently, there was all sorts of fantasy. But at that time, we found it hard. And from also, before I did go to CBS, I did another job on Pete and Gladys, save job, show doctor job, and that was a strange situation where a show was made for Harry Morgan, and Cara Williams within it, but during the course of the show, she became the star, and he became like a second banana. But we did save that show, and off that, I was hired at CBS. What made them so great is they allowed great writing. They allowed good stories to go on the air. This doesn't often happen in a lifetime. Great writers were writing from the heart, and they were getting on the air, and it was marvelous. Not only that, writers were allowed to write what they were best at. In my case, I was writing plotted stories, mystery stories, things that I love to write. And it was a joy for me. It was like being set free. And this is what I like most about the anthologies, the freedom. It doesn't come often. In stepping from producer to executive producer, there is very little change, especially if you're executing to producing at a network. What it meant in my case is that they assigned all their comedy shows to me. Now that didn't mean that I worked on every show. The only shows that I concentrated on were the ones that were in trouble. The ones that are not in trouble, you don't touch. When I was given Jack Benny, I wrote a letter to Irving Fine and said, wow, this is another show which I'll have nothing to do except say great work. And that was the case. And that went on with Beverly Hillbillies and shows like that. Most of my shows were good shows, but not all of them were respected as they should be by the network. And this was particularly true of the Dick Van Dyke Show, which was not getting numbers, and numbers is what they live by. And they were all for taking it off the air, so that every Monday, our general meeting time, I had to argue, this is a great show. It has to come through. Give it a chance for the personalities to take on. The way things worked in television is you have to give a certain time to a show in order for the personalities that are in it to take hold or not. Once they take hold, it no longer has a name. Like the Lucy Show will become the Lucy Show. That's all you know about the person who's the lead, or whoever is leading the Dick Van Dyke Show. Doesn't have a title, just the name of the person whose personality takes on. And that took a little longer, despite good stories. It didn't take on for maybe 10, 12 weeks, and it was in trouble all that time. I knew the audience had to grow to love them. It had nothing to do with story. The stories were good and capable. All of them were written by Reiner, Carl Reiner. Before the show was sold, he had written something like 2 years of shows. He was astoundingly prolific. But in any case, he seemed to be writing all of them in the first year. And they were good and what he wanted. But what any show has to have is time for the personalities to take hold. And they did.
What was your job on the Dick Van Dyke Show?
Not creative. An executive at a studio is not creative unless he has to. If it is an unofficial suggestion. It is nothing official. You just watch over the fate of the show and try to help wherever you can in little ways. There is nothing big that you can do. The fate of a show is in the hands of the creators and the workers. The anthology shows are what I love most, but the one that I also loved was the Thin Man. It was my type of writing and what I liked, the ingenuity of it. I loved doing locked room mysteries, things like that. Those delighted me, and I think I had most fun. on the Thin Man. Regarding Lucille Ball and Desilu, no, I never did collaborate with her on anything. On Miss Grant Takes Richmond, I never did get to meet her. I did socially at Desilu, but not on any work at all. But there was a joy doing the Desilu Playhouse. There again, it was anthology, and I worked with great people, and on some of them I got endless letters of fan letters, just thousands and thousands of fan letters on Desilu Playhouse. On Martin's Folly particularly, this was with Carl Reiner. He was in it, and I got not only fan letters, but approval from organizations who thought it was a great family show for whatever reason. There isn't a thing that occurs in life that doesn't have a story that goes with it. And I can have small experience that occur to me as stories. I can see the story in them. And just yesterday, I had an experience with a little dog that I was playing with, and I said, "There's a story in you," you know? And and the story that occurred to me was of Hollywood dogs trained by trainers, acting in pictures, who go on strike against the cruelty against other animals. I said, "Dad, you got to write this." You know.
So
But anything I look at is a story to me. Not all stories require research. Most stories that are just human require no research, just feelings. But some do. If you're writing a story, as I have, about South America, Colombia, the jungle, it requires that your facts be accurate, and you go to a library. Now, I guess writers would go online, which may be easier, but in those days, we went to a library and researched extensively. The structure is determined by what you want to say in the end. And structure means putting a character in jeopardy, giving him problems that have to be solved. All those negatives will let you arrive ultimately at a solution, which is the positive. How does he get out of that jeopardy? How does he solve his problems? As my favorite literary agent, Carl Brandt, said, and I may have said this before to you, a good story changes its main characters. Whether it's come to realize or whatever, it does change them. And this is, and it may also change the situation. This is what is known as structure. Some people call it first, second, and third act. And in a sense, I deplore so many of the movies that are made today, which are one-dimensional. They are like still portraits. And I say, well, it's not a picture. And I want to see development. I want to see a first, second, and third act. And that means putting a person in jeopardy or giving him a problem and then solving it in your own fashion, out of your own experience, out of what you feel in your own heart. If you need money, I think the first draft should come up in 2 days. Or if somebody says, I need this in 4 weeks, it should come up in 4 weeks. If you're pleasing yourself, it may take several years. In looking at a screenplay and deciding what to cut, you have to look at many things. One is length, which is a luxury because you can go through and cut what you don't like. What you cut is things that are unnecessary, unentertaining, or plain bad. There's nothing else to cut. Everything else is essential. In my writing, I've never thought about the camera at all, hardly. I've only thought about the scenes and put in the necessary directions, that changes of scene and whether long or short or things like that. But intricate camera movements have never been any concern of mine. In building my main characters, I hear them and talk with them before anything goes on paper. I become as familiar with them as I can, and very important to me is that I must have some emotion about them. I must like them or fear them or something. But also important to me, and this is something I miss in current pictures, is so many of them that I see are interesting in a way, in a vague way, but have no real rooting interest. That may be said in the form of all the people in it are bad, or none of them quite good. And you say to yourself, what am I rooting for in this story, in this picture? And there's nothing. So it's important to me that I have a rooting interest. In the old days, the days of the moguls and the big pictures, they did it very simply. They immediately got sympathy for their characters. It was important. They knew it. One of the first things they would do with Harold Lloyd at the start of a picture is having him feed milk to a cat. Now you immediately like him, and you're with him, and you're sympathetic. And the same may go with Buster Keaton or anybody like that. In writing a screenplay, what I consider good dialogue is dialogue that is both true and moves you in some way. It reveals the feelings of your people. It isn't just talk. The words express something that is going on to or between people. And you're meant to feel dialogue as well as just listen and hear it. You must have some response to it. The words "I love you" have meaning, and together with action, sometimes they have a great impact.
Okay, great.
They say that a couple of words on stage accompanied by a slap in the face, there's no greater dramatic act than that. My object is always to entertain, which, depending on the kind of picture it is, shapes the scene or the dialogue, and one has to resist sometimes the pressures of producers in this respect, who don't quite understand sometimes what is going on. In writing a screenplay for Sylvan Simon, which was a comedy, he kept saying, "More jokes, Dev, more jokes." And I kept saying, "Sylvan, you can't do that." I said, "I have 3 to 4 jokes on a page now, and that's much too tight." He says, more, you can get 6. I said, "No, you can't possibly do that, because a joke needs a build-up. There can be a build-up as long as a page to one joke," but he didn't quite understand. He kept putting pressure. More jokes. There are only 3 things that start a writer. One is the need to express something. that he wants others to hear or know. The other is to need admiration for what you have written and how you've written it, or getting it sold. And the third is the need for money. There are, I knew no other reasons for writing myself. An average working day varies. If you're writing on a deadline, a very short deadline, you get up at 6 in the morning and start working, and you work till lunch, have your lunch, work through the afternoon, have your dinner, work through most of the night, leave yourself about 3 hours to sleep. If you're writing for yourself, you get up in the morning, think about your story, and then decide that this is a good day to go out and play golf. And that's what you do. In terms of my own writing, it has changed through the years. I write wherever I am and wherever I can. I can write sitting on a bed with a pad in my hand, or in a study, which I've had in the various houses that I've built, or as I am now in an apartment where every room is a workroom. There's nothing on which isn't loaded with papers and machines, and every room in the house is a workroom, and I use them all. Who could be inspired more than the books of Shakespeare, who I think of as more than a human being, but like a god? How can he be equaled? An inspiration always. Of all the writers that come to mind, the one that seems most consistent to me in terms of ability and greatness is Billy Wilder. He didn't seem able to do anything that was bad. And what's most impressive in that area is that even when he was directing and producing, I remember sitting with him in the locker room of the Beverly Hills Tennis Club in the early 40s, and his saying, with that little accent of his, I couldn't be a director if I wasn't first a writer. And that impressed me very much. And I think that's true of many directors. If they don't have a writer's mentality, I don't know how they can direct. He was great, though. He was working at the time with Charlie Brackett, a name that may be familiar to another wonderful writer and producer, who sent me a letter that I treasure when we first negotiated on writers' credits and got it. Got the ability to determine our own credits. He wrote me a letter and said, if all can be expressed in words, he said, I would express it now. Congratulations. He sent me that letter because he didn't think that studios would ever give up the right to determine credits. And apparently he didn't know, as I didn't know at the time, that they were only too delighted to give that up. They didn't want that trouble. There is nothing that has really changed anything in my writing except the needs of the moment. I have written in so many different styles, in so many genres, that it would be hard to count. I just have this ability to invent myself for anything that has to be done. I enjoyed every job that I've had, every assignment. I've just enjoyed the challenge and done my best. Making the most important mistake that I feel I've made is in not doing what I would want to do, want to have done, and that is writing more films that had meaning, more films that came from the heart. And this didn't seem important to me in all the days I was working. The only thing that seemed important at the time was that I was working and doing what they wanted. And in all that time, I never got a bad review. So I thought I must be doing something right, but I wasn't. And I envy those who write from the heart. And if there's anything that I regret, it's that I didn't allow myself to do that through my entire career. But my work has always been on assignment, intellectually. Dev, we have this problem. We need this kind of story. This is for Red Skelton. This is for so-and-so. And I know what to do. In that respect, I've been discovered 4 times in Hollywood for comedy, for farce, for drama, for tragedy, things like that. It's not because I have changed anything. It's because those were the assignments that I had. In building a house, your only regret will be what you don't put into it. So do it now. And that is what I feel about my career and all careers. And that is to do what you want to do part of the time and what only you want to do, and write from the heart and your own head. Let it come out, and that will make the best product for you in the end. Most writers are consumed by the negative, which is fine. I think you have to accent the negative to get to the positive. And if you were to ask most writers in town, they would say, I don't know how long I can get away with this stuff. How long can I get away with this? But the fact is, they're really not getting away with it. They are good. They just have that self-doubt, and that's in most beginners. And I would say to them, fight on. You've got it. Do it. It's worth it.